Titanic, the time capsule. When RMS Titanic slipped beneath the surface of the North Atlantic in the early hours of April 15, 1912, the ship did not simply disappear. Instead, she became something else, a silent time capsule. The bow section of Titanic descended slowly into the darkness, sinking with a strange and almost gentle motion. Unlike the violent breakup that destroyed much of the stern, the forward section remained largely intact. Inside, cabins, corridors, and personal belongings were left exactly where they had been only moments before. Shoes remained beside beds, chairs sat quietly at tables. Personal items rested on shelves. Time, in a sense, stopped. More than 2 miles below the surface, in freezing darkness, Titanic settled onto the ocean floor. There, shielded from sunlight and human disturbance, many of these objects remained untouched for more than a century. 110 years later, explorers would descend into that darkness. What they found was not just a wreck. They found a snapshot of 1912. The Titanic had existed in a world of strict social customs and formal expectations. Society at the time placed great importance on appearance, etiquette, and status. These traditions shaped life aboard the ship, from the grand first-class lounges to the modest third-class cabins. Even clothing followed strict rules. Men were expected to dress properly in public at all times. Suspenders, considered undergarments, were never meant to be seen. Waistcoats covered them carefully. Hats were not merely fashion accessories. They were symbols of social standing and personal identity. A gentleman would remove his hat indoors without fail. He would raise it politely when greeting a lady. Seasonal styles also mattered. Straw hats in summer, wool and felt hats in winter.
Stay on the line.
Even among third-class passengers, hats were common. Flat caps and simple fabric headwear reflected more modest means. But the tradition remained. These small details formed part of Titanic's world.
Correct junction.
And remarkably, some of these details still exist today. More than 80 years after the sinking in 2001, filmmaker and explorer James Cameron sent robotic submersibles into Titanic's bow section. These remotely operated vehicles carefully navigated narrow corridors and damaged cabins, revealing scenes unseen since 1912. Light from the submersible pierced the darkness. Dust and rust drifted slowly through the water. Inside one first-class stateroom, debris covered the floor. Furniture had collapsed. Walls had deteriorated. Yet among the scattered remains, something unexpected appeared. Resting quietly on the floor was the brim of a gentleman's hat, perfectly preserved. More than a century had passed, yet the object remained where it had fallen, a simple personal item left behind in the final hours of the ship's life. But that hat was not just an object, it belonged to someone. And behind it lay a remarkable story, the hat that never returned. The hat lay quietly on the floor of a first-class stateroom. More than a century had passed, yet it remained where it had been left. The fabric had faded, the structure had weakened, but its shape was still unmistakable, a gentleman's bowler hat. It rested beside what appeared to be the remains of a collapsed wardrobe. Debris surrounded it. Rust-colored sediment drifted slowly through the water. Light from the submersible illuminated the scene with an eerie stillness.
No contact. Stay on the line.
But this was not just any cabin. The room had once belonged to Henry Sleeper Harper and his wife Myra Harper. Henry Harper was a wealthy American publisher and a member of the famous Harper & Brothers publishing family. The couple had been traveling through Europe, Asia, and Egypt before boarding Titanic for their journey home to America. They did not travel alone. Accompanying them was their interpreter, Hamad Hassab, a quiet and reserved man whose presence reportedly drew curiosity from other first-class passengers. Also traveling with them was something even more unusual. Their small Pekingese dog, Dee, named Sun Yat-sen. The tiny dog quickly became known among passengers. In the elegant surroundings of Titanic's first-class areas, the presence of such a small companion seemed almost surreal. On the night of the collision, the Harpers were asleep in their stateroom. Then, shortly before midnight, Titanic struck the iceberg. At first, the impact seemed minor, but soon stewards began waking passengers. The Harpers were told to dress warmly and proceed to the boat deck. They made their way upstairs. Outside the gymnasium on the starboard side, they waited among other passengers. It was here that First Officer William Murdoch was supervising lifeboat loading. Murdoch followed the rule of women and children first, but he also allowed men aboard when no more women could be found nearby. This decision would later save several lives. As lifeboat number 3 prepared to leave, space remained. The Harpers were allowed to board. Henry Harper, Myra Harper, Hamad Hassab, and incredibly, their small Pekingese dog all entered the lifeboat. They pushed away from Titanic as the ship continued to sink. From the safety of the lifeboat, they watched the great liner slowly disappear into the darkness. They survived. But behind them in their stateroom, Henry Harper's hat remained. Perhaps it had been left behind in the rush to leave. Perhaps it had fallen during the ship's final moments. No one could know for certain. Today, the cabin still rests within Titanic's bow section. The porthole nearby remains open, an unusual detail noticed by explorers. Opening such a porthole required manually unscrewing a heavy bolt, suggesting that someone inside the cabin may have opened it after the collision. Perhaps they were trying to see outside. Perhaps they were trying to understand what had happened. Whatever the reason, the open porthole and the abandoned hat remain silent witnesses. They are small details, but together they tell a powerful story. A couple preparing for sleep, a sudden awakening, a hurried journey to the lifeboats, and a personal belonging left behind forever more than 2 miles below the surface. The hat still rests quietly, a simple object, a silent reminder of a night that changed history forever. And it was only one of many haunting details still waiting inside the wreck. The last wireless signal at the time of her maiden voyage, Titanic carried one of the most powerful wireless systems afloat. Wireless communication was still a relatively new technology in 1912. For passengers crossing the Atlantic, the ability to send messages from the middle of the ocean felt almost miraculous. Titanic's wireless system gave the ship a voice. Depending on atmospheric conditions, that voice could travel hundreds, sometimes even thousands of miles across the ocean. The wireless room itself was located on the boat deck, in a crew-only area near the bridge. It consisted of 3 main spaces: a small accommodation room where the operators rested, the Marconi room where messages were transmitted, and the silent room containing the heavy electrical machinery. This machinery was cutting edge for its time. Motor generators, condensers, receivers, switchboards, battery systems, all working together to transmit signals across the Atlantic. Titanic also carried 2 wireless operators, something not common at the time. Jack Phillips, the senior operator, and Harold Bride, the junior operator, worked around the clock, sending passenger messages and receiving navigation warnings. Passengers could dictate messages from the inquiry office. These were then sent through pneumatic tubes hidden inside the ship's walls, traveling up to the wireless room where operators transmitted them to shore. For many passengers, it was a marvel of modern technology. But on the night of the disaster, the wireless room became something else. It became Titanic's final voice. After the iceberg collision, Captain Edward Smith ordered the operators to begin sending distress calls. Phillips and Bride immediately began transmitting messages requesting assistance. No. Ships across the North Atlantic began to respond. The closest vessel to answer was RMS Carpathia. Phillips continued sending distress signals. CQD, then later SOS, the messages went out repeatedly. As Titanic sank lower, the ship's power began to weaken. Steam pressure dropped. The electrical generators began to slow. The wireless signal gradually weakened. Ships that had been receiving Titanic's messages noticed the signal fading. Her voice was growing quieter. Inside the wireless room, Bride worked to adjust the machinery. Beneath the main switchboard were regulators that controlled the power of the signal. These controls allowed operators to increase the strength of transmission. Bride attempted to push the system harder. He adjusted the regulators, increased generator speed, balanced power output. He was trying to keep Titanic's voice alive. But time was running out. Water was rising inside the ship. The deck tilted. The machinery strained under failing power. At approximately 2:10 a.m., Titanic's wireless signal suddenly stopped. The final transmission ended. Titanic's voice fell silent. Years later, when explorers reached the wreck, they searched for this historic location. Much of the Marconi room had collapsed, walls had deteriorated, the transmitting area had suffered heavy damage, but inside the silent room, something remarkable remained. The machinery still stood, twisted wires, scorch marks, damaged equipment. These details told a story. Evidence suggested that as water reached the equipment, a powerful short circuit occurred. The electrical system likely sparked violently, creating intense heat and fire before finally shutting down. The position of the switchboard handle told another story. It had been turned off.
Correct junction.
This suggested that Harold Bride may have returned to the room in the final moments to shut down the equipment before abandoning the area. It was a small but telling detail, a final act in the ship's last minutes. Today, the remains of Titanic's wireless machinery still stand deep beneath the ocean. Rusted and silent, they mark the place where the final calls for help were sent. Jack Phillips would not survive the disaster. Harold Bride would. But together they gave Titanic her final voice. And for those who answered, that voice meant the difference between life and death, and the Turkish bath frozen in time. Luxury at sea was central to Titanic's design. The ship had been built not just to cross the Atlantic, but to create the illusion of a floating hotel. Passengers in first class were meant to forget they were even on a ship. Few places represented this philosophy more clearly than Titanic's Turkish bath complex.
Keep it clean.
Located deep
Slow
within the
hands
ship
only.
on F deck, the Turkish bath was one of the most exotic and impressive spaces aboard. Inspired by Middle Eastern architecture, the complex featured richly decorated rooms, colorful tiles, and ornate lighting. At the time, Turkish baths had become popular in Britain during the 19th century. Public bathing facilities designed in Middle Eastern style had appeared across the country, offering relaxation, steam rooms, and cooling chambers. Titanic's designers brought this idea to sea. The complex included cooling rooms, steam rooms, hot rooms, shampooing areas, changing rooms, and even an electric bath. Passengers entered through a beautifully decorated cooling room. Wooden paneling surrounded colorful hand-painted tiles. Brass lanterns hung from the ceiling. Decorative domes crowned the doorways. It felt less like part of a ship and more like a luxurious spa. The Turkish bath quickly became one of Titanic's most talked-about features. Passengers visited to relax, socialize, and escape the chill of the North Atlantic. But on the night of the collision, this peaceful space became part of Titanic's final story. After striking the iceberg, Steward Joseph Wheat was awakened and went forward to investigate. There, he saw mail clerks struggling as water began entering the mail sorting room. Recognizing the danger, Wheat rushed toward the Turkish bath area.
Don't force it.
With the
Back
help
and
of
reset.
Steward George Dodd and bath attendant John Crosby, Wheat manually closed two heavy watertight doors, separating the Turkish bath from other compartments. It was difficult work. The doors were heavy and required manual effort, but they succeeded. For a time, the Turkish bath
Correct
remained
route.
protected. Shortly afterward, Wheat noticed something troubling. Water began trickling down the staircase from above. This was a critical moment. It meant that water had begun spilling over the tops of the watertight compartments. Titanic's safety system was being overwhelmed. The ship's fate was now sealed. Wheat made his way to the boat deck and eventually found space in a lifeboat. He survived the sinking. Below deck, the Turkish bath slowly filled with water. But unlike other parts of the ship, this flooding occurred gradually and gently. The result was extraordinary. When explorers later reached Titanic's wreck, they discovered that the Turkish bath complex was among the best preserved areas of the entire ship. Hand-painted tiles remained in place. Decorative walls, still visible architectural details largely intact. Even after more than a century, the room looked remarkably recognizable. A thin layer of silt covered the floor. Rust formations hung from surfaces, yet the overall structure remained surprisingly complete. Because Joseph Wheat had closed the watertight doors, another nearby space remained sealed, Titanic's swimming pool. To this day, it remains inaccessible, hidden behind those closed doors. It may be even better preserved than the Turkish bath itself. But no one knows for certain. The Turkish bath now rests in darkness far beneath the Atlantic. Once filled with warm steam and quiet conversation, it now sits silent and still. A luxurious retreat frozen in time, a place where passengers once relaxed, unaware of the fate waiting just hours away. The glass still standing across Titanic, most cabins followed a similar design. Bathrooms were usually shared, especially in second and third class. Passengers would leave their cabins and walk down corridors to reach communal facilities. But even the simplest cabins included small wash basins. In first class, these wash basins were often part of elegant wooden cabinets. They included mirrors, shelves, and small rails designed to prevent items from falling as the ship moved through the ocean. These rails were important. Ships constantly rolled with the movement of the sea. Without protection, objects placed on shelves could easily slide and fall. For passengers, these small details added comfort and practicality. For explorers more than a century later, they became something else. They became clues. During a 2001 expedition, robotic submersibles entered Titanic's bow section. Many cabins had collapsed, furniture lay broken, walls had deteriorated, yet in several rooms wash basins still stood. Then explorers noticed something remarkable. On one of the shelves, a water jug and drinking glass remained in place. The sight was astonishing. After Titanic broke apart, the bow section plunged more than 2 miles to the ocean floor. The descent was violent. When the bow struck the seabed, the impact crushed decks, twisted steel, and destroyed large sections of the ship.
Correct route.
The force was immense. Water surged through compartments, structures collapsed, heavy equipment shifted
Correct
violently,
junction.
yet somehow this small glass and jug remained standing. Protected only by a thin metal rail, the survival of these fragile objects seemed almost impossible. But there was another detail,
This
even
crack
more
is en
haunting.
route.
Archival photographs of Titanic's cabins showed that stewards typically placed glasses upside down before passengers arrived.
Stairwell
This kept them
confirmed.
clean and ready for use. But this glass was sitting upright. This suggested something deeply personal. At some point during the voyage, someone had used the glass. They had taken a drink, placed the glass back on the shelf, and left the cabin. Perhaps they expected to return shortly. Perhaps they were told to go on deck after the collision. Perhaps they never imagined they would not come back. More than a century later, the glass still sits exactly where it was placed, untouched, unmoved, frozen in time. It is one of the most haunting details inside the Titanic wreck, because unlike large pieces of steel or machinery, this was something personal. A quiet moment, a final drink, a small object left behind during one of history's most famous disasters, and beyond Titanic's bow, scattered across the ocean floor, thousands of other objects still remain. Silent reminders of a ship that never returned. The debris field of memories far below the North Atlantic, Titanic does not rest as a single ship. Instead, she lies in 2 main sections. The bow and the stern, separated by nearly 600 meters across the ocean floor. Between these 2 massive structures lies something haunting, a vast debris field. This area stretches across the seabed like the aftermath of a great explosion. Scattered across the darkness are thousands of objects once belonging to Titanic and the people aboard her. Bed frames, chairs, plates, shoes, pipes, metal fragments. Each piece tells part of the story. It resembles less a shipwreck and more an underwater time capsule of a single catastrophic moment. Among the debris, explorers discovered something unexpected. Wine bottles, champagne bottles, hundreds of them. Titanic had been stocked with enormous quantities of beverages for her passengers. The ship carried thousands of bottles of wine, champagne, beer, Titanic, and spirits to serve first-class guests during the crossing. These bottles had originally been stored in the ship's first-class dining saloon and bar areas. When Titanic broke apart, these storage areas were destroyed. Bottles spilled out and scattered across the ocean floor, yet many remained intact. Some champagne bottles still had their corks firmly in place. The wire cages around the corks remained attached, unchanged after more than a century underwater. The survival of these bottles revealed something about the extreme environment of the deep ocean. At Titanic's depth, the water pressure is immense. Anything hollow is usually crushed. Wine bottles suffered this fate. Many corks had been forced downward into the necks of the bottles, ruining the contents. But champagne bottles were different. Champagne is naturally pressurized. The internal pressure inside the bottles helped them resist the crushing force of the ocean depths. As a result, some champagne bottles survived intact. Cold, dark conditions also preserved their contents. In other shipwrecks, recovered champagne has even remained drinkable after decades underwater. The deep ocean acts like a natural cellar, keeping bottles chilled and protected from light. It is a strange thought. Bottles prepared for a celebration in 1912 now rest silently on the ocean floor. A celebration that never happened. Elsewhere in the debris field, explorers discovered other haunting objects, fragments of decorative glass windows, colored floor tiles, twisted metal structures. Some tiles still retained their original colors: red, blue, gold. These tiles once decorated Titanic's grand public rooms. They formed part of the illusion that passengers were not on a ship, but inside a grand hotel. Even after more than a century, these colors remained visible beneath layers of sediment. Another discovery shocked early explorers: the porcelain head of a child's doll. Once beautifully painted, the doll had lost its body and clothing over time. Sea organisms had stripped away fabric and hair. The porcelain face remained pale and ghost-like. The image was unsettling, a reminder that children had traveled aboard Titanic, and that some never returned. Among the most symbolic discoveries were the ship's lifeboat davits. These large crane-like structures once held Titanic's lifeboats. Today, many lie twisted across the seabed, but one davit remains standing. Its position tells a final story. On the night of the sinking, First Officer William Murdoch worked frantically to launch lifeboats. One davit lowered collapsible lifeboat C shortly before the end. After lowering the boat, Murdoch and Sixth Officer James Moody began preparing another collapsible lifeboat. But before they could complete the task, Titanic's bow plunged downward. Water rushed across the deck. Time ran out. The lifeboat floated free as water surged over the ship. Murdoch and Moody were swept away. Neither survived. Today, that davit still stands, frozen in the position where they last worked. It remains a silent monument to their final efforts.
This crack is en route.
Across the debris field, Titanic's story is written in scattered objects. Each one represents a moment, a life, a memory. More than 2 miles below the surface, these objects remain untouched by time. 2. Shoes rest side by side, bottles lie in the sand. Fragments of luxury sit in silence. Titanic may have disappeared beneath the ocean, but the traces of her passengers and crew remain, and together they form one of the most haunting underwater landscapes in history. A ship frozen in silence. More than a century has passed since Titanic slipped beneath the surface of the Atlantic. Yet deep below, the ship remains. Silent, still unchanged by the passage of time. When explorers first discovered the wreck in 1985, they expected to find only twisted metal and scattered debris. Instead, they found something far more powerful. They found traces of human life. Shoes resting beside each other on the seabed. Personal belongings scattered across the wreck cabins, still recognizable after more than 100 years. These discoveries transformed Titanic from a historical disaster into something deeply personal. Each object tells a story. Each detail captures a moment. Each fragment represents a life interrupted.
Stay calm.
Among the most famous areas of the wreck is the bow section. Unlike the stern, which was violently destroyed, the bow descended more gently. As a result, much of its structure remains intact. Railings still stand, anchors remain in place, decks remain recognizable.
The wreck remains largely undisturbed.
When submersibles approach the bow, Titanic appears almost like a ghost ship emerging from darkness. The famous forward rail still exists. The same rail where passengers once stood, The same rail seen in photographs, the same rail that has become part of Titanic's legend. Yet now it sits in darkness, covered in rust formations known as rusticles. These rusticles slowly consume the ship's steel. Over time, Titanic is gradually returning to the ocean. Explorers have also discovered personal items scattered throughout the wreck. Shoes, suitcases, eyeglasses, jewelry. These objects often remain where they fell during the sinking. Because organic material decomposes over time, leather shoes sometimes mark the locations where victims once rested. These discoveries are among the most haunting aspects of the wreck. They serve as quiet reminders of the people who never escaped. Titanic's grand interiors have also left traces. Fragments of the grand staircase, decorative wood, paneling glass windows. Although much of the interior has collapsed, explorers can still identify locations that once represented the height of luxury. The ship that had once been described as unsinkable now rests slowly dissolving in darkness. Marine life has claimed the wreck. Fish move silently through corridors. Bacteria consume steel. Sediment slowly settles over the decks. Nature is gradually reclaiming Titanic. Despite this, the wreck remains remarkably preserved. Cold temperatures, extreme depth, low oxygen levels. These conditions slowed decay, but time continues its work. Experts estimate that Titanic will eventually collapse completely. Rusticles weaken the structure year after year. Storms above create currents that disturb the wreck below. Someday, Titanic may disappear entirely, leaving only debris scattered across the ocean floor. Yet even as the ship fades, her story endures. Titanic was more than a ship. She represented ambition, innovation, confidence in technology. Her sinking shattered those beliefs. More than 1,500 lives were lost. Families were changed forever. Communities mourned. But Titanic also changed maritime safety. Lifeboat requirements increased, ice patrols were established, wireless communication rules improved. The tragedy led to reforms that saved countless lives in the decades that followed. Today, Titanic rests in silence. No lights, no voices, no movement, only the slow drift of particles in the deep ocean. More than 2 miles below the surface, the ship remains as a monument to those who sailed aboard her. A reminder of ambition, a reminder of tragedy, a reminder of humanity. Titanic began her voyage as the greatest ship in the world. She ended as one of history's most powerful stories, and beneath the cold waters of the Atlantic, the wreck of Titanic remains. Frozen in silence, frozen in time, forever.